There's really only one way to react to the mass murder of innocents: shock, horror, anger, and a burning desire to see the perpetrators of such evil punished. Anything else, like calls for restraint or hair splitting about who's really to blame, or business as usual perhaps from political leaders, not a big concern, well, that shows a seriously faulty moral compass. Restraint? Well, that's you, Penny Wong. Like splitting hairs? Well, that's coming from far too many in the media who have clearly swallowed the Hamas propaganda in their historical ignorance. And the more or less business as usual response, well, that's the Prime Minister, who can find time to shed a tear in the dirt at Uluru about his voice, but not until late this afternoon unequivocally condemn this hate, as we saw his UK counterpart Rishi Sunak do in a remarkably powerful speech in a London synagogue overnight.
I wanted to come here tonight to stand with you in this hour of grief, as we mourn the victims of an utterly abhorrent act of terror. To stand with you in this hour of prayer, as we think of those held hostage and your friends and loved ones taking refuge in bomb shelters or risking their lives on the front line. And perhaps above all, I wanted to come here tonight to stand with you in solidarity in Israel's hour of need. As the Prime Minister of this country, I am unequivocal. The people who support Hamas are fully responsible for this appalling attack. They are not militants. They are not freedom fighters. They are terrorists. Their barbaric acts are acts of evil.
In that clear demonstration of what real leadership looks like, the UK Prime Minister outright rejected any attempt at moral equivalence that some in the media are trying to get up, that we have seen from weak politicians here on the left. Greens MPs like Senator Mehreen Faruqi, who said it was a disgrace for the Australian Parliament to show solidarity with Israel. Or Labor frontbenchers like Tony Burke, who has still failed to condemn the violent hate from the Islamic preacher at an event in his own electorate on Sunday night. But no such weakness from Prime Minister Sunak.
There are not two sides to these events. There is no question of balance. I stand with Israel. We stand with Israel. The United Kingdom stands with Israel against this terrorism today, tomorrow, and always.
And he spoke out powerfully against any attempt to target Jews in Britain.
I say, not here. Not in Britain. Not in our country. Not in this century. My first duty is to protect you. We will not tolerate this hate. We will not tolerate this anti-Semitism. And I promise you, I will stop at nothing to keep you safe.
Here in Melbourne overnight came this terrifying post from the Australian Jewish Association regarding multiple reports, it said, about, and I quote, a carload of Arabs hunting for Jews. And this admission too from the New South Wales Police Acting Commissioner that even though Monday's shameful pro-Hamas, anti-Israel protests in Sydney were not legal, that they were not authorised, it was the police that in fact escorted the crowd from the town hall and down to the steps of the Opera House.
We were better to facilitate that march to the Sydney Opera House. They had a point of destination, undesirable for everyone, how it may have been, but we had no power, if we didn't facilitate that march, to stop people walking down there anyway.
What's worse, arrests look very unlikely.
Identification of the individuals involved in that proved exceptionally difficult at the time, so we are going through an investigative process at the moment, and if we can identify offenders from Monday committing offences, we will take action.
Indeed, it would seem the only person that the police arrested was Mark Spiro, who turned up holding an Israeli flag. And that's why today, in complete damage control and scrambling to look like they were doing something, the New South Wales Police have set up what they're calling a protest task force. Yet with a very large protest set for the weekend, again, unauthorised, you can only imagine the vile hate that will spill out again on the streets of Australia.
At this stage, I would encourage people not to attend that assembly on Sunday that is currently proposed because they do have no protections.
And all this comes with confirmed reports out of Israel of the terrorist depravity that's confronted soldiers and medics today as they reach the dead in communities near the Gaza border. Hundreds of innocent civilians, including women and children, many of them who were raped first, and some who were beheaded, including dozens of babies. And yet here in Australia, seen around the world, was the vision of Australians marching on the Opera House, lit up in the colours of the Israeli flag, screaming, "Gas the Jews, F the Jews."
Where's the Jews? Where's the Jews? Where's the Jews?
Now that's bad enough, but what was almost worse was the reaction of people who should always be clear about whose side they're on. The police who escorted the racist mob to the Opera House. The Labor and Greens MPs have been silent in their condemnation of this anti-Semitic hate. And until Premier Minns finally intervened this morning with an apology to Sydney's Jewish community, the New South Wales Attorney-General, the Police Minister too, well, they seem to think that they've done the right thing, warning the friends of the innocent off the street while making the streets safe instead for the supporters of terrorism. This is developing into a crisis for the Labor Party, but particularly the Albanese government. Having a significant Middle Eastern community in your electorate can't justify silence in the face of evil. It shouldn't warp your perceptions of what Australia's values are or Australia's national interest. Yet the deafening silence of senior ministers Tony Burke and Chris Bowen about the weekend's atrocities, or their mealy-mouthed pleas for the protection of everyone that in practice would only hamper a strong and justified Israeli response, shows how easily principles can be corrupted by squalid politicking and ethnic branch stacking. There was something deeply incongruous about a Prime Minister in the past 24 hours, deeply emotional about how Indigenous Australians might react to a lost referendum, but comparatively detached about the enormity of this massive loss of life from terrorism, or the shame that these protests in Sydney at our iconic Opera House, the shame that that brings to us all. The fact that we still don't have any confirmation from the Prime Minister that the National Security Committee of Cabinet has even met to talk about our security response to any local ramifications of these events, well, that simply staggers me. Or possible global consequences should Hamas develop into a wider war of extermination against Israel. Similarly of concern was the fact that Australia, the staunchest friend of Israel up until the election of the Albanese government, the fact that Australia was absent from a significant joint statement by world leaders expressing solidarity with Israel, issued by the White House, the statement involving the leaders of the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, but not Australia. Does our Prime Minister not believe, as this statement declared, that the terrorist actions of Hamas have no justification, no legitimacy, and must be universally condemned? Does he not want to ensure Israel is able to defend itself? It's hard to imagine that we wouldn't have been asked to support this statement. Hard to imagine we wouldn't have been asked to support it. And it's dreadful to think that the moral confusion of the Labor left might have stopped Australia from doing so. Tonight, the Prime Minister is in Melbourne and he has now visited a synagogue before headlining a Labor fundraiser at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. In Sydney, Peter Dutton will soon speak at a large Jewish event, a prayer service in Sydney. It's in responding to unexpected crises that governments reveal their true mettle. And so far, Labor in Canberra and Sydney are failing us utterly.